Renee was reaching for the funeral program when a woman she had never seen before walked toward Williams's casket with 3 children. The woman stopped beside them and lowered her voice. "Go say goodbye to your dad." Renee looked up. The children didn't hesitate. The oldest walked straight to the casket. The little girl touched Williams's hand through the flowers. The youngest was crying so hard he could barely stand. Renee waited for someone to react. Nobody did. Williams's sister didn't move. His closest friend kept his eyes down. Even the pastor seemed to know exactly who they were. For the first time that day, Renee wasn't looking at the children. She was looking around the room, and she realized something that hurt almost as much as losing her husband. She might be the only person there who didn't know who they were. Welcome to Mr. Graham's story, where every story leaves a lesson. Whether you're new here or part of our growing family, thank you for being here. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and as the story unfolds, tell me what you would have done in the same situation. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. It helps us bring more meaningful stories to people around the world. Now, let's begin today's story. Renee looked back at the 3 children. The woman standing beside them was watching her now, and there was something in her expression that made Renee realize this wasn't the first time she had been asked to explain why Williams had kept them apart. Renee first noticed that Williams listened. It wasn't anything dramatic. He wasn't the loudest person at the table, and he didn't seem interested in becoming the center of attention. A mutual friend had invited them both to dinner in Atlanta, and while everyone else talked over one another, Williams stayed mostly quiet, occasionally leaning forward when someone was speaking. When Renee mentioned something about a difficult week at work, he remembered it the next time they saw each other. "You survived?" he asked. She smiled. "Barely. I figured." "You figured? You looked like somebody who was going to survive out of spite." That made her laugh. It was a small thing, but Renee remembered it. Their relationship didn't begin with the kind of excitement people later exaggerate when telling the story. There was no dramatic first kiss in the rain or instant certainty that they had found the person they would marry. They simply kept seeing each other. Dinner became coffee. Coffee became long conversations. Long conversations became the kind of comfortable silence that made Renee realize she didn't have to fill every quiet moment around him. Williams was steady. If he said he would call, he called. If Renee mentioned that something in her house needed fixing, he remembered. If she had a stressful day, he didn't immediately tell her what she should have done differently. Sometimes he just listened. That mattered to her. By the time they had been dating for several months, Renee had begun trusting him in the ordinary way people trust someone who has repeatedly given them reasons to. One evening they were sitting in his car outside a restaurant after dinner when the conversation turned to past relationships. Williams mentioned Marissa. "My ex-fiancée," he explained. Renee looked at him. "You were engaged?" "For a while." "What happened?" He stared through the windshield for a moment. "We weren't good together anymore." Renee waited. He didn't offer much more. She didn't push. After a few seconds, she asked, "Any kids?" "No." The answer came quickly. Renee nodded. That was it. She didn't know that the answer required an explanation. She didn't know that somewhere outside the life she could see 3 children already existed. And Williams did not think of himself as lying in that moment. At least not in the way Renee would eventually understand lying. The children were connected to Marissa. Williams wasn't their biological father. He didn't live with them. His relationship with Marissa had ended. In his mind, he was building a completely separate life. So when Renee asked the simple question, Williams gave himself permission to give the simple answer. No. Then he changed the subject. Renee didn't notice the significance of it. She was more interested in what kind of man Williams was becoming in her life. He was the kind who noticed when her tire looked low, the kind who remembered how she took her coffee, the kind who would call after a difficult meeting and say, "You sound tired. Don't tell me you're still at the office." She would sometimes laugh and say, "How do you know?" "I know you." She liked hearing that. She liked being known. That was part of why the lie was able to survive. Renee wasn't careless with trust. She simply believed that when 2 adults chose to build a life together, they should not have to investigate one another like strangers. She didn't search through Williams's phone. She didn't question every unfamiliar number. She didn't demand explanations for every Saturday afternoon that belonged to him. She believed privacy and secrecy were different things. Williams knew that, and every time he chose silence, he told himself he was preserving something good. A few months after their conversation about children, Williams drove to see the 3 children. One of them had a birthday. He brought a gift and stayed longer than he had planned. The youngest ran toward him before he had even closed the car door. "Dad!" Williams smiled and caught the child before he could crash into him. For a while, he forgot about the life he had described to Renee. He was simply their father. Later that evening, Marissa watched him helping the children with their gifts. "You're going to tell her, right?" she asked. Williams didn't look up. "Tell her what?" Marissa gave him a tired look. "You know what?" He sighed. "It's complicated. It was complicated 10 years ago." Williams rubbed his forehead. "I'll handle it." "When?" He didn't answer. Marissa watched him for another moment. "You keep saying you're going to handle it." "I will." Then Williams's phone buzzed. "Renee." He looked at the screen and something changed in his expression. He stepped away from the children before answering. "Hey," Renee's voice was warm. "You home yet?" "Not yet." "Everything okay?" "Yeah, I'm fine." There was a pause. "Okay, drive safe." "I will." When the call ended, William stood in the driveway for several seconds. Marissa was still watching him. "You see?" she said quietly. Williams put the phone in his pocket. Not tonight. And that was how the secret grew. Not through one enormous decision. Through another night, another excuse, another promise that there would be a better time. Renee went to sleep that night believing she knew the man she loved. Williams went home believing he had only postponed one difficult conversation. He did not yet understand that postponing the truth was already changing the marriage he hoped to build with her. By the time Renee and Williams got married, she had stopped thinking about his old relationship with Marissa. There was no reason to. As far as Renee knew, Marissa belonged to a chapter Williams had already closed. They had been engaged, it hadn't worked out, and Williams had moved on. Renee never felt like she was competing with anyone. That was important to her. She had seen enough relationships fall apart because one person was always suspicious of the other. She didn't want that kind of marriage. So when Williams told her he had a long Saturday afternoon obligation, she usually accepted it. When he stepped outside to take a phone call, she didn't follow him. When a birthday on the calendar seemed to put him in an unusually thoughtful mood, she assumed he was remembering something from his past. And when he occasionally spent money she didn't recognize immediately, she trusted that he had a reason. Williams had always been careful with money. That was one of the things Renee admired about him. He kept track of bills. He noticed when insurance premiums changed. He didn't buy expensive things just to impress people. Once, Renee teased him about how long he spent comparing 2 nearly identical appliances before buying one. "You know they're both going to do the same thing, right?" "They're not the same. They heat food. One uses less electricity." She laughed. "See? This is why I married you." William smiled. "Because I'm cheap, responsible. That's the nicer word." Those were the kinds of moments Renee remembered. Not grand gestures, not expensive vacations. The ordinary things that made a marriage feel dependable. They developed routines without really discussing them. Williams usually handled the bills on Sunday evenings. Renee kept track of appointments and family birthdays. They had favorite restaurants, favorite television shows, and arguments about things that were too small to remember a week later. Sometimes Williams left his socks beside the laundry basket instead of inside it. Renee complained. He said the basket was close enough. She told him that was not how baskets worked. He laughed. Years later, she would remember that argument and wonder how many other ordinary moments had contained something she never knew. But at the time, their life felt normal. More than normal, it felt safe. There were no obvious signs that Williams was maintaining another family identity. He didn't disappear for entire weekends. He didn't come home smelling like someone else's perfume. He wasn't constantly guarding his phone. His secret survived in smaller pieces, a call from the car, a payment made without much explanation, a Saturday afternoon he described as an obligation, a birthday that seemed to matter more to him than Renee understood. Once, Renee came downstairs and found him sitting at the kitchen table with his phone in his hand. He was smiling, not his usual smile, a softer one. She stopped in the doorway. "What?" Williams looked up. "Nothing. You're smiling. Am I not allowed to smile? Not without telling me why." He laughed and put the phone face down. "Just something funny." Renee walked over and kissed the top of his head. "Okay." She didn't ask again. That was Renee. She didn't believe love meant demanding access to every private thought. Williams watched her walk away. For a moment, guilt crossed his face. Then the feeling passed. He told himself he was protecting their marriage. That was how he justified almost everything. Meanwhile, the children continued growing. Williams attended birthdays. He helped with school expenses. He answered their calls. He knew which child was struggling with school and which one had started talking about college. He was not a distant father. He was simply a hidden one. And the longer the arrangement continued, the more complicated it became. One evening, Renee was sorting through paperwork when she noticed a recurring expense. She held up the statement. "What's this?" Williams glanced at it. "School. For what?" He hesitated. "A program I'm helping with." Renee looked at him for a second. "Your program?" "Something like that." She didn't press. "Okay." Williams nodded. "Okay." That single word should have ended the conversation. Instead, it stayed between them for a moment. Renee eventually returned to the paperwork. Williams looked down. He knew he had gotten away with another incomplete answer, and that should have bothered him more than it did. The problem was that every time Renee trusted him, Williams experienced relief. Not gratitude, relief. There was a difference. He wasn't thinking she deserves the truth. He was thinking, I have more time. That became the pattern. At home, he was Renee's husband. Outside their home, he was dad. He convinced himself those identities could remain separate because neither one was fake. That was the part that made the lie so difficult to confront. Williams loved Renee. He loved the children. He wasn't pretending. He was simply refusing to let the people he loved know the whole truth about one another. One Saturday, Williams was preparing to leave when Renee looked up from the kitchen counter. "You'll be back for dinner?" "Probably." "Probably?" "I might run late." She nodded. "Okay." He reached for his keys. Renee watched him for a second. "Williams?" He turned. "Yeah? Everything okay?" He smiled. "Everything's fine." She smiled back. "All right. Drive safe." He left. Renee returned to what she was doing. Williams sat in his car for several seconds before starting the engine. He knew what she had really been asking. He also knew what he had really answered. And once again, neither of them said it out loud. By the time Renee and Williams had been married for several years, the secret no longer felt temporary to Williams. That was the problem. In the beginning, he had imagined there would be a right moment to tell her. After they had been dating a little longer. After the wedding. After they had settled into married life. After a particularly stressful season passed. There was always a reason to wait. Then one evening the children were sitting around the table eating pizza when the oldest looked at Williams. "Dad?" "Yeah?" "When do we get to meet Renee?" Williams stopped with the napkin halfway to his mouth. The other two children looked up. He lowered the napkin. "Why are you asking that?" "Because she's your wife." Williams glanced toward Marissa. She didn't say anything. The child shrugged. "I know you love her." Williams swallowed. "I do. Then why doesn't she know us?" There was no easy answer. Williams looked down at the table. "It's complicated." The child frowned. "You always say that," Marissa finally spoke. "Because he keeps making it complicated." Williams gave her a warning look. Marissa ignored it. The children became quiet. Williams leaned back. "Listen, I am going to tell her." "When?" He didn't answer immediately. "Soon." The child looked at him. "You said that last year." Williams had no response. Marissa watched his face. She had seen that expression before. He wasn't angry. He was cornered, and Williams hated feeling cornered. Later, after the children had gone into the other room, Marissa stood by the kitchen counter. "You can't keep doing this." Williams rubbed his hands together. "I know." "No, you know and then you do it again." "I said I know." "They're getting older." "I know. They know you have a wife." Williams looked away. They've started asking why she doesn't know them. I'll tell her. When? He sighed. I don't know. Marissa stared at him. You've had years. Truth was that he had begun to fear the conversation more than he feared the secret. When he first met Renee, he had convinced himself that the children were simply part of an old chapter. Then Renee became serious. Then they married. Then their marriage became good. That changed everything. He had more to lose. Every year of silence made the next conversation harder. Williams imagined Renee sitting across from him. He imagined her face changing. He imagined her asking why he had lied. He imagined her wondering whether Marissa had ever really left his life. He imagined her asking whether the children were the reason he had always been protective of certain dates. He imagined questions he couldn't answer without admitting something he was ashamed of. And beneath all of those fears was one he rarely acknowledged. What if Renee didn't understand? What if she saw the children as proof that his past had never really ended? What if she asked him to choose? Williams told himself he was protecting everyone from that possibility, but some nights when he was alone in his car, he knew he was also protecting himself. Renee noticed the changes without understanding them. Williams had become quieter around certain birthdays. Sometimes he checked his phone and smiled before putting it away. Other times he would read a message and sit still for several seconds. Everything okay? Renee asked one night. Yeah, you sure? I'm just tired. She studied him. Okay. She returned to her book. Williams looked at her. He almost said it. The words were there. There are 3 children. He could have started with that. He could have told her about Marissa. He could have explained that he wasn't their biological father. He could have explained that he had chosen to remain dad anyway. He could have told her that the children mattered to him. Instead, he said nothing. That night, Renee fell asleep beside him. Williams stayed awake. He stared at the ceiling and told himself he would tell her soon. It was a promise he had made so many times that it no longer sounded like a promise. It sounded like a habit. And then something happened that made the situation harder. One of the children called Williams after school. The child's voice was different. Dad? What's wrong? I need you. Williams sat upright. What happened? The child explained. Williams listened. He didn't hesitate. I'll be there. He got dressed and left. Renee was in the kitchen when he came downstairs. Where are you going? Something came up. Is everything okay? I'll explain later. She nodded. Okay. Williams paused at the door. For a second he looked back at her. He could tell her now. He could say, this is about one of the children. Instead he said, I'll be back. Then he left. Renee watched the door close. She didn't chase him. She didn't call him repeatedly. She trusted him. That trust was exactly what Williams had been relying on gone. But later that night, when Williams returned, Renee was already asleep. He stood in the bedroom doorway for a moment. He looked at her, then at his phone. There was a photograph of the children on the screen. Williams locked the phone. He told himself he had done the right thing by being there for them, and in one sense, he had. But the truth was becoming harder to ignore. He was no longer choosing between telling Renee and protecting the children. He was choosing between honesty and the temporary comfort of avoiding it. Marissa understood that before he did. A few weeks later, she confronted him again. Williams, they deserve to stop feeling like a secret. He sat quietly. I know. And Renee deserves the truth. He looked down. I know. So tell her. Williams didn't answer. Marissa's voice softened. You're not protecting anybody anymore. That sentence stayed with him, because somewhere inside he knew she was right. The secret had started as something he thought he could manage. Now it had its own history, its own promises, its own consequences. And Renee was still living beside him, believing she knew the major chapters of her husband's life. She didn't. Not yet. Williams had a different voice when one of the children called him. Renee had noticed that years earlier without knowing what it meant. At home, he was usually relaxed, sometimes distracted, sometimes joking, sometimes too tired to talk much. But on certain calls, his whole attention changed. Hey, buddy, or how'd it go, or simply, I'm listening. He never rushed those conversations. Renee had heard him from another room more than once. She assumed he was talking to a relative or helping someone from work. She never imagined he was talking to a child. On one Saturday afternoon, Williams sat in his car outside a school gymnasium while one of the children finished an activity inside. His phone buzzed. "Dad, are you still there? I'm right here. You said you were watching. I am watching. You can't watch through the phone." Williams laughed. "That's fair." The child laughed too. Williams looked through the windshield toward the gym entrance. "I'll see you when you come out." "You better." "I better." "Yeah, okay, I'll be here." When the call ended, Williams stayed in the car. He had promised himself he would only be there for an hour. 2 hours later, he was still waiting. When the child finally came outside, Williams stepped out and held up both hands. "How'd you do?" "I did okay." "Okay, I didn't win." "So?" The child shrugged. Williams smiled. "You think I only show up when you win?" The child shook their head. "Good." They walked toward the car together. Moments like that were why Williams couldn't imagine simply walking away. Whatever the biology said, whatever his past with Marissa had become, this was his child in every way that mattered to him, to pretend otherwise. And that was precisely why the secret had become so difficult. Renee had no idea. Later that evening, Williams came home with a small paper bag in his hand. Renee looked up from the kitchen. "What'd you get?" "Nothing," she smiled. "You always say that when it's something." He pulled out a sandwich. "For me." "Very exciting." "I know." She laughed. Williams leaned against the counter and watched her for a moment. He almost told her. The thought came so quickly that it surprised him. "There are children. Not one, 3. He imagined saying it. He imagined Renee asking who they were. He imagined explaining Marissa. Then he imagined the questions that would follow. Instead, he took a bite of the sandwich. Renee shook her head. "You're weird. I've been told." She went back to what she was doing. The moment passed. Again. A few weeks later, Williams attended one of the children's birthday celebrations. Marissa had arranged a small gathering. There was cake, food, family friends, and too many balloons. Williams stood near the kitchen doorway while the children opened gifts. One of them ran over. "Dad, look." Williams bent down. "That's nice. You like it?" "I do." "You didn't even look." Williams laughed. "Let me look again." Marissa watched from across the room. When the children moved away, she approached him. "You have to tell her." Williams sighed. "Not today." "When?" "I don't know. You always say that." "I'll figure it out." Marissa folded her arms. "The kids are noticing. I know. They know you have a wife. I know. They're starting to think something is wrong with them." Williams's expression changed. "That isn't what I want. Then stop making them feel hidden." He looked toward the children. "I love them. I know you do. I'm not ashamed of them. I know that too." Marissa lowered her voice. "Then why are they still a secret?" Williams didn't answer. Because he didn't have an answer that sounded good anymore. He could explain why he had started the secrecy. He could explain why he'd been afraid at the beginning. But after all these years, there was no longer a clean reason. There were only consequences. That night, one of the children asked him a question while he was helping clean up. "Dad? Yeah? Does Renee know about us?" Williams stopped. "No." The child looked down. "Why?" Williams crouched beside them. "It's complicated." The child frowned. "You always say that." "I know. Is she going to be mad?" Williams took a breath. "I don't know. Does she hate us?" "No." The answer came immediately. "She doesn't even know you." The child looked at him. "Then how can she not like us?" Williams had nothing to say. The question followed him all the way home. Renee was sitting on the couch when he walked through the door. "You're late." "I know. Sorry." She moved over so he could sit. "You okay?" "Yeah." She studied his face. "You seem somewhere else. Just tired." Renee nodded. She didn't press. William sat beside her. For a moment he looked at the woman who trusted him enough not to demand an explanation. Then his phone vibrated. He glanced down. A message from one of the children. "Love you, Dad." William stared at it. Renee noticed the change in his face. "Who is it?" Williams locked the phone. "Nobody." Renee looked at him. He smiled weakly. Just somebody from work. She accepted the answer, and that was the part Williams would remember later. Not that Renee had failed to ask more, that she had asked once and he had lied without hesitation. He had spent years telling himself the children were hidden because he loved them. But sitting beside Renee that night, Williams began to understand something he had avoided for a long time. The children weren't the only people living with his decision. Renee was too. She just didn't know it yet. And for the first time, the secret didn't feel like something he was protecting. It felt like something he was passing from one year of his life into the next. Williams found out on an ordinary Tuesday. Marissa called him while he was leaving work. "Can you talk?" He could hear something in her voice. "What happened?" "It's about the kids." Williams stopped beside his car. "Are they okay?" "They're fine." He waited. Marissa took a breath. "There's something you need to know." By the time she finished explaining, Williams was sitting behind the wheel without turning the engine on. He stared at the parking lot. For several seconds he said nothing. Marissa stayed quiet. Finally Williams asked, "Are you sure?" "Yes." He closed his eyes. There had always been a part of him that believed the past was complicated but settled. Now it wasn't. One of the children had learned that Williams was not the biological father. The information had come out through family records and a conversation that had gone further than anyone expected. The child was confused. Williams understood why. He also understood what the discovery could mean. He could step back. He could tell himself that biology had clarified something that had never been his responsibility in the first place. Instead, he called the child. "Hey." There was silence on the other end. "Dad?" "Yeah. Is it true?" Williams swallowed. "What did you hear?" "That you're not my real dad." Williams looked down at the steering wheel. He could have corrected the language. He could have asked what real meant. Instead, he said, "I didn't know how to explain this. So it's true?" "Yes." Another silence. Then the child asked the question Williams had been afraid of. "Are you still my dad?" Williams didn't hesitate. "Yes." The answer came before he could think about it. "Yes, I'm still your dad." The child began crying. Williams's own eyes filled. "I didn't go anywhere," he said quietly. "You didn't?" "No." "Okay." Williams sat in the parked car long after the call ended. That evening he went to see the child. There was no big speech, no dramatic promise. They sat together for a while. Eventually the child leaned against him. Williams put an arm around them. That was enough. He knew then that whatever else happened, he wasn't walking away. Being a father had never depended entirely on biology. He had made that choice years ago. Now he had to live with it. But the decision created another problem. Renee. How could he explain this to her? How could he tell his wife that he had 3 children she didn't know existed, that he had been raising them for years, and that one of them wasn't even biologically his? He imagined Renee listening. He imagined her asking why he had never told her. He imagined her asking what Marissa still meant to him. He imagined her wondering whether every birthday, every phone call, every unexplained expense had been part of something bigger. And then he imagined the question that frightened him most. Why didn't you trust me? Williams had no answer that didn't make him look guilty, because he was guilty. Not of having children, not of loving them, not of staying when biology became complicated. He was guilty of deciding that Renee couldn't handle the truth without ever giving her the chance to prove him wrong. Marissa's house later that week. She was standing at the kitchen counter when he walked in. "How is the child?" "Better." "Good." Williams sat down. Marissa waited. "I told him I'm still dad. You are. I know." She looked at him. "Then tell Renee." Williams looked away. "It's not that simple. It hasn't been simple for 12 years. He didn't answer. Marissa pulled out a chair across from him. "You know what I think?" Williams sighed. "Probably. I think you're more afraid of Renee's reaction than you're worried about what the children need." "That's not fair, isn't it?" Williams rubbed his jaw. "I don't want to hurt anybody. You're already hurting people." He looked at her. Marissa's voice softened. "The kids know they're being hidden." Williams looked down. "They don't deserve that. No, they're not ashamed of me. I know. They're not asking me to choose. I know. Williams was quiet. Marissa leaned back. So who are you protecting? He didn't answer, because the question landed differently this time. For years, Williams had told himself the secrecy was about protecting the children. But after the paternity discovery, that explanation no longer covered everything. The children needed honesty. Marissa wanted honesty. Renee deserved honesty. The only person who still benefited immediately from silence was Williams. He went home that night and found Renee sitting at the dining table sorting mail. She looked up. You're late. Yeah. Long day? Very. She pushed a glass of water toward him. Sit down. He did. For a moment they talked about ordinary things. A bill. Something Renee had seen at work. A restaurant they hadn't been to in a while. Then Williams looked at her. He nearly said it. Instead, he reached across the table and took her hand. Renee smiled. What? Nothing. She squeezed his hand. You're acting strange. I know. Are you going to tell me what's wrong? Williams looked at her. There it was. The opening he'd been waiting for. He could finally tell her. He could stop carrying the secret, but fear won. I'm just tired. Renee studied him for a second. Then she let it go. Okay. William squeezed her hand, and in that quiet moment, he understood something he had spent years avoiding. The children were no longer the reason he was keeping quiet. He was. He was afraid of losing Renee, afraid of being judged, afraid of having to explain why the man she trusted had built a second life without her knowledge, afraid that once the truth was spoken, he could never put their marriage back the way it had been. So he chose silence again. The decision felt different this time. It wasn't protection. It was fear. And Williams knew the difference. Williams died before he told her. There was no final confession, no carefully planned conversation at the kitchen table, no chance for Renee to watch his face while he explained the children, Marissa, or the years of silence. One day he was still the man she expected to come home. Then he wasn't. The funeral was held in Atlanta several days later. Renee remembered very little about the service itself. She remembered people hugging her. She remembered hearing Williams's name spoken by people who had known him for years. She remembered the photographs. She remembered standing beside the casket and thinking that the man inside it looked strangely unfamiliar. Not because his face had changed, because death had suddenly made every unanswered question permanent. She had spent years believing there would always be another conversation, another evening, another chance to ask something she didn't understand. Now there wouldn't be. As the service neared its end, Renee stood quietly near the casket. Her hands were folded in front of her. She was exhausted. She wanted to go home. She wanted the day to be over. Then she noticed a woman walking toward the front of the room. White, maybe around Williams's age. 3 children were walking beside her. Renee didn't recognize any of them. At first, she assumed they were relatives. Maybe cousins, maybe children of someone Williams had known through work. The woman stopped several feet from the casket. She looked at the children. Then she touched the youngest one gently on the shoulder. Go say goodbye to your dad. Renee looked up. The children didn't hesitate. The oldest moved toward the casket. The little girl followed. The youngest started crying before he even reached it. Renee stared. She waited for someone to react. Nobody did. Williams's sister remained seated. One of his closest friends lowered his eyes. The pastor didn't interrupt. The woman didn't look embarrassed. She simply stood there while the children grieved. Renee felt something tighten in her chest. She looked from the children to the woman, then around the room again. Nobody looked confused. Nobody looked surprised. That was when the first thought came. Who are they? Then another. Why does everybody else seem to know? The oldest child reached the casket and placed a hand against the flowers. I love you, Dad, he whispered. Renee heard it clearly. She stepped forward. Excuse me. The woman turned. Their eyes met. For a second, neither spoke. Renee's voice came out quieter than she expected. Who are you? The woman looked at the children, then back at Renee. I'm Marissa. The name landed harder than Renee expected. She knew that name. Williams had told her about Marissa years ago. his former fiancée, the relationship that had ended before Renee came into his life. Renee looked at the 3 children. "Those are your children?" Marissa hesitated. "They're his." Renee stared at her. "My husband?" Marissa nodded. "Yes." Renee's face went still. The room seemed to become quieter, although nothing had actually changed. She looked at the children again. The little girl was crying against the casket. The youngest had both hands pressed against his face. The oldest stood beside them, trying hard not to cry. Renee couldn't make the pieces fit. "You mean—" She stopped. Marissa waited. Renee lowered her voice. "Williams had children?" Marissa looked down. "Yes." Renee took one step backward. For 12 years, Williams had told her he had no children. 12 years. The thought came so clearly that she almost said it aloud. Instead, she asked the only question she could manage. "Were you 2 together?" Marissa's expression changed. "No." Renee looked at her. "During my marriage?" "No." "Then what is this?" Marissa glanced toward the children. "This is their father." Renee shook her head slowly. "They were born before me?" "Yes." The answer should have brought relief. There had been no affair, no secret girlfriend during the marriage, but somehow Renee didn't feel relieved, because now the question was worse. If these children had existed before her, if Marissa wasn't Williams's other woman, if Williams had spent years showing up for them, then why had he looked Renee in the eyes and told her he had no children? Renee looked around the room once more. The same people were standing where they had been. Some knew, some had probably known for years, and she suddenly felt like the only person in the room who had been living inside a different version of her own marriage. Marissa stepped closer. "I know this is a lot." Renee almost laughed. It wasn't a laugh of humor. "A lot?" Marissa stopped. Renee looked toward the casket. "He never told me." "I know. You knew." Marissa's eyes filled. "Yes." Renee looked at her sharply. "How long?" Marissa didn't answer immediately. That silence told Renee enough to make her stomach drop. "Marissa, I've known for years." Renee looked at the children, then at Williams, then back at the woman standing in front of her. She had come to the funeral expecting to say goodbye to her husband. Instead, she was standing beside 3 children who called him Dad, and for the first time since Williams died, Renee understood that the funeral wasn't the end of her questions. It was the beginning of them. Renee waited until most of the people had left before she asked Marissa to talk. She didn't want the children there. She didn't want Williams's family listening. And she definitely didn't want another conversation about her husband happening in the middle of a funeral home hallway. Marissa understood. They sat in a small room near the back of the building. For several seconds, neither woman spoke. Renee kept her hands folded in her lap. "Start with the beginning." Marissa nodded. "Williams and I were engaged." "I know that. We were together before you met him." "I know that too." Renee looked at her. "What I don't know is why you showed up at my husband's funeral with 3 children and called him their father." Marissa lowered her eyes. "Because he was." Renee's jaw tightened. "That doesn't answer my question." "No," Marissa said quietly. "It doesn't." She took a breath. "The children were born before you and Williams met. He stayed involved after we separated." Renee stared at her. "How involved?" Marissa hesitated. "Very." Renee looked away. She already knew what that meant. Still, she asked, "Were you 2 together at any point during my marriage?" "No." "Never?" "Never." Renee studied her face. Marissa didn't look defensive. She looked tired. "How long have you known about me?" "Since before you got married." Renee's eyebrows lifted. "Williams told you?" "He told me he was getting married. And you were okay with that?" Marissa gave a small, humorless smile. "I wanted him to be happy." Renee looked down. That answer was harder to process than anger would have been. "If you knew about me," she said, "why didn't you tell me?" Marissa looked at her for a long moment. "Because it wasn't my secret to tell." Renee almost laughed. 3 children were your secret too." "No." Marissa shook her head. "The children were never a secret to me. Williams made them a secret from you." That distinction landed. Renee leaned back. So you knew he was lying to me?
Yes.
How long? Marissa looked down at her hands.
Years.
Renee's face tightened. And you just watched?
I didn't just watch.
Marissa reached into her purse. She pulled out her phone.
I told him to tell you.
Renee didn't move. More than once. Marissa unlocked the phone and scrolled. I told him when the kids were little. I told him after you got married. I told him when they started asking questions. She held out the phone. Renee hesitated before taking it. The first message was short. You need to tell her. Another followed months later. The kids know you have a wife. They don't understand why she doesn't know them. Renee kept scrolling. Another message. You can't keep promising them that everything will be okay if you're the one keeping them hidden. Her thumb stopped. She looked at Marissa. These are real? Marissa nodded. Renee looked back at the screen. There were years of messages, not romantic messages, not secret meetings, not the kind of conversation Renee had expected to find. They were arguments about honesty, about the children, about Williams's fear, about the promise he kept making and breaking. One message from several years earlier caught Renee's attention. She deserves to know who you are. Renee read it twice. Then she handed the phone back. You really wanted him to tell me?
Yes.
Why? Marissa looked toward the door.
Because the kids were getting older.
Renee waited.
They knew Williams loved them, Marissa continued. But they also knew there was this whole part of his life they weren't allowed to touch.
Renee swallowed. Did they know about me?
Yes.
How?
He talked about you. That hurt, unexpectedly.
Renee looked down.
What did he say?
Marissa smiled faintly.
He said you were good to him.
Renee closed her eyes for a second. That simple sentence somehow made everything worse, because if Williams had spoken kindly about her to the children, then the lie wasn't built on hatred. It had been built alongside affection. Marissa watched her.
He loved you, Renee.
Renee opened her eyes.
Please don't tell me that. I'm not trying to make you feel better.
Then don't. Marissa nodded.
Okay.
Renee took a breath.
I need to understand something. What? Why?
Marissa didn't answer. Renee's voice became quieter.
Why would a man who loved me hide something this big?
Marissa looked at her.
I asked him that for years. And what did he say?
He said he was afraid.
Of me? Of losing you?
Renee stared at the floor. Marissa continued.
He thought if you knew about the children, you'd think he was still tied to me.
Renee gave a short, bitter laugh.
He was tied to you. Because of the kids, I know.
She looked up.
But he could have told me.
Yes.
He should have told me.
Yes. Renee waited for Marissa to defend him.
She didn't. That mattered.
You're not going to tell me he had good intentions?
Marissa shook her head. He did.
Renee looked at her sharply.
That doesn't make what he did right.
No.
Marissa's voice stayed calm. He loved the children, he loved you, and he was still wrong.
Renee sat very still. For the first time since the funeral, somebody had said the things she needed to hear. No excuses, no attempt to turn Williams into a villain, no attempt to make him innocent, just the truth. Renee looked at the phone again. How long did you plan to tell me? Marissa's expression changed. Recently. Renee frowned.
What does that mean?
He had started preparing.
Preparing how?
Marissa hesitated. He was writing something.
Renee's eyes narrowed.
What?
A letter.
Renee's breathing changed.
Where is it?
I don't know.
Renee stood.
The chair moved slightly behind her. She looked toward the door, suddenly thinking about the house, Williams's belongings, his desk, the things she had not yet been able to touch since he died.
Marissa watched her. He was finally going to tell you, she said.
Renee looked back.
Then why didn't he?
Marissa's eyes filled.
Because he died.
Renee said nothing. For 12 years, Williams had kept telling himself there would be another time. Now there wasn't. And somewhere in the house they had shared, there might be a letter written by a man who had finally decided to tell his wife the truth. Only after he had run out of time to hear what she would say. Renee did not go home and start tearing through Williams's things that night. She wanted to. Instead, she sat at the kitchen table and stared at the stack of mail he had left behind. For 12 years, she had never had a reason to question the way he handled money. Now every ordinary number looked different. The next morning, she opened the financial records. At first, nothing stood out. Mortgage payments, utilities, insurance, groceries, the usual expenses of two adults living together. Then Renee found a series of payments she didn't recognize. Not one, not two, years of them. School-related expenses, activity fees, medical bills, small transfers made at regular intervals, nothing extravagant. That was what bothered her. Williams hadn't been secretly funding some enormous second household. He had been quietly taking care of children. Renee sat back. She opened another statement, then another. The pattern became impossible to ignore. There were payments around the same months every year. Birthday-related purchases, school expenses, things that taken separately could have been explained. Together they told a different story. Renee reached for her phone. She almost called someone. Instead, she put it down. She wasn't ready to hear another person's voice. She needed to see it herself. Later that afternoon, she found an envelope in one of Williams's desk drawers. Inside were photographs. The first showed Williams standing beside a birthday cake. One of the children was holding a balloon. Williams was smiling at the camera. Renee stared at the photograph. She had seen that shirt before. She remembered him wearing it. She remembered asking him where he'd been that Saturday. He had said he was helping someone with something. Renee turned the photograph over. A date was written on the back. She checked the calendar from that year. It was the child's birthday. She put the photograph down. Another showed William sitting in a folding chair at what looked like a school event. Another showed him beside the children at a restaurant. Another showed all three of them together. They were older in that one. Renee's fingers tightened around the edges. This wasn't recent. This wasn't something Williams had started doing after she married him. He had been there for years. She found a photograph of him helping one of the children with homework. Another showed him standing beside a car after what looked like a school event. The details were ordinary. That was what made them painful. There was no evidence of some dramatic double life. There was evidence of a man showing up, again, and again, and again. Renee put the photographs across the table. For a long time, she simply looked at them. Then she remembered something, a Saturday several years earlier. Williams had come home late. She had asked where he'd been. He'd said he had an obligation. She remembered being mildly annoyed. Nothing more. Now she wondered whether that had been one of the days in the photographs. She opened another drawer. There were old appointment cards, receipts, notes, and envelopes. Some were addressed to Williams, some were from schools. One contained a handwritten reminder about a birthday. Another had a child's name written across the top. Renee sat down slowly. The evidence wasn't hiding anymore. It was everywhere. She had simply never known what she was looking at. Her phone rang. "Marissa," Renee answered. "Hello? Did you find anything?" Renee looked at the photographs. "Yes." Marissa was quiet. "How much did he tell you?" Renee gave a small, disbelieving laugh. "Apparently nothing. I meant about the children. Nothing." Marissa exhaled. "I figured." Renee looked down at the table. "Did they know about me?" "Yes." "Did Williams talk about our marriage?" "Yes." "What did he say?" Marissa hesitated. "He told them you were important to him." Renee closed her eyes. "Did he ever promise them anything?" "What do you mean?" "That they would meet me." Marissa was quiet. Then she said, "Yes." "How many times?" "I don't know." Renee opened her eyes. "He told them?" "More than once." Renee looked at the photographs again. "Then why didn't he?" "I don't know." "You were with him for years. You must have known." Marissa sighed. "I knew what he told me. I didn't know what he was going to do." Renee leaned back. "Did he really believe he was protecting them?" "Yes. From me. From everything." Renee frowned. Marissa continued. "He thought if the children became part of your life, there would be questions about their father, about me, about the past. He thought keeping everything separate would make things easier."
Renee looked at the photographs. Did it? No. The answer came quickly. No, Marissa repeated. Renee didn't respond. She didn't need to. That evening, she found another message on Williams's old phone. It was from one of the children. Dad, are we ever going to meet Renee? Renee stared at the screen. There was no reply. She scrolled farther. Another message from months earlier. You said this year, then another. I thought you meant it this time. Renee lowered the phone. Her eyes filled. She wasn't crying for Williams, not yet. She was thinking about the children. They had been waiting too. Williams had not only hidden them from Renee, he had kept promising them that someday the hiding would end, and then he died. Renee walked to the living room and sat on the couch. For 12 years she had believed the marriage had one private history. Now she was discovering that the man beside her had been carrying another one the entire time. The strangest part was that nothing about those 12 years suddenly became fake. The dinners had happened, the jokes had happened, the anniversaries had happened, the quiet evenings had happened. Williams had loved her during those moments, and apparently he had loved those children too. That was the part Renee couldn't fit into a simple answer. She could have understood betrayal. She could have understood an affair. But this was something else. Williams hadn't built a second life because Renee meant nothing. He had built one because he believed he could keep the two parts of himself separate, and now Renee was beginning to understand how much effort that had taken. She looked toward his desk. Marissa had said he was writing something. Renee stood. She walked to the desk and opened the top drawer. Nothing. The second drawer. Receipts. The third. Old photographs. She almost closed it. Then she noticed a thin folder pushed behind some papers. Renee pulled it toward her. There was no name on the front. Just one line in Williams's handwriting. For Renee. She stopped breathing for a moment. Whatever was inside that folder had been waiting for her, and suddenly Renee wasn't sure she wanted to know what her husband had finally decided to say. Renee kept her hand on the folder for several seconds before opening it. The handwriting on the front was unmistakably Williams's, for Renee. She sat down at his desk. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded in half. She unfolded it. The first line made her stop. I should have told you a long time ago. Renee put the paper down. She stared at it, then picked it back up. There were only a few paragraphs. Williams had written that he had spent years trying to find the right way to tell her about the children. He admitted there had never been a right way. He wrote that every time he planned to talk, he became afraid of what would happen afterward. Renee read slowly. Then she reached the sentence that made her grip the paper tighter. You deserved the truth before you ever had to discover it. She leaned back in the chair. For a moment she closed her eyes. That was the sentence she had needed from him. Not an excuse, not an explanation that made everything acceptable. Just an acknowledgement that she had been wronged. She continued reading. Williams wrote about the children. He said he had stayed in their lives because they needed him and because somewhere along the way, being their father had stopped feeling like a choice. It simply was. Renee wiped beneath one eye. Then she read about Marissa. He explained that their relationship had ended long before he met Renee. There had been no secret romance during the marriage, no plan to return to Marissa, but the children had kept Williams connected to that earlier part of his life, and he had been afraid Renee would see that connection as something more. Renee stopped again. She looked toward the doorway. Then you should have trusted me, she whispered. The house gave her no answer. She returned to the letter. Williams admitted that the longer he waited, the harder it became. At first he had been afraid of ruining something new. Then he was afraid of damaging something good. Eventually he realized he was mostly afraid of facing Renee after admitting what he had done. That part hurt, because it meant the secret had not only been about protecting the children, it had also been about protecting himself. Renee read the sentence twice. I kept telling myself I was protecting everybody, but I know now that I was also protecting myself from your anger. She placed the letter on the desk. For several minutes, she didn't touch it. Then she picked it up again. There was another paragraph. Williams wrote that the children had begun asking more questions. They wanted to meet Renee. They wanted to understand why their father's wife didn't know them. He admitted that their questions had forced him to face what his secrecy was doing to them. He had finally realized that hiding them was teaching them something he never wanted them to learn, that love sometimes had to exist in the shadows.
Renee's eyes filled. She read the final lines. I don't know if you'll forgive me. I don't know if you should. But I don't want you to believe I kept them from you because you weren't enough. Renee stopped. That was the sentence that broke whatever control she had been holding on to. She covered her mouth. The tears came quietly, not because the letter had fixed anything. It hadn't. If anything, it made the loss more complicated. Williams had known exactly what he was doing. He had known Renee deserved the truth. He had known the children were being hurt by the secrecy. And still he had waited. She looked at the unfinished page. There was no signature, no final sentence. The letter simply stopped. Renee ran her finger over the empty space beneath the last paragraph. He had been writing it. He had intended to finish, but he hadn't, and now she would never know what he planned to say next. She folded the paper carefully, then unfolded it again. A sound came from the hallway. Renee looked up. Marissa stood there. She must have been let in by one of Williams's relatives. For a moment, neither woman spoke. Marissa looked at the paper in Renee's hand. You found it. Renee nodded. Was he really going to tell me? Yes. When? Marissa hesitated. Soon. Renee gave a tired smile. That's what he always said. Marissa looked down. I know. Renee folded the letter. Did he tell you what he was going to say? No. Did he tell you he wrote this? He told me he had started. Renee looked at the unfinished page. He didn't finish. Marissa's face softened. No. Renee looked toward the window. For 12 years, Williams had postponed a conversation because he feared what the truth might do. Now the truth was sitting in Renee's hands, and the man who had caused all of it was gone. There would be no apology spoken across a table, no explanation she could challenge, no chance to ask him why he had trusted his fears more than he trusted her. Only this unfinished letter. Renee stood and placed it back inside the folder. Marissa watched her. What are you going to do? Renee looked at her. I don't know. And for once, she didn't try to pretend she had an answer. She had spent 12 years living with a version of Williams that he had carefully given her. Now she was beginning to understand that the secret had never been only about the children. It had been about control. Williams had wanted to decide when Renee knew, how she knew, what she believed, and how she reacted. He had kept postponing the truth because he wanted to control the consequences, but death had taken that control away. Renee looked down at the folder one last time. She knew the truth now, and for the first time there was nothing Williams could do to decide what she would do with it. The first argument about Williams's belongings happened 3 days after the funeral. Renee was sitting at the dining table with a folder of papers in front of her when Williams's sister looked across at her. What are we going to do about the children? Renee's fingers stopped moving. She had been expecting questions about the house, the accounts, the paperwork, not that. I don't know, she said. Williams's sister looked uncomfortable. They're his children. I know, and he was taking care of them. Renee looked down at the papers. I know that too. Nobody spoke for a few seconds. The problem was that Williams had left behind responsibilities no one had fully understood until he was gone. There were school expenses, regular payments, personal belongings he had kept for the children, things he had apparently intended to provide for them. Renee looked at the list in front of her. Some of the expenses were familiar now. Others weren't. She could see the pattern clearly. Williams had been showing up. The question was what happened now that he couldn't. Marissa sat across the room with the children. The youngest was holding a small framed photograph of Williams. Renee watched him run his thumb across the edge of the frame. He looked up and caught her staring. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then the boy looked away. Renee felt something twist inside her. These children hadn't asked for any of this. They hadn't asked to be hidden. They hadn't asked for their father to die. And they certainly hadn't asked to arrive at a funeral and discover that their existence had become a complicated subject. Renee pushed the papers aside. What did Williams tell them? Marissa looked at her. About what? After he was gone, before the funeral, what did he tell them about me? Marissa hesitated. He told them you were his wife. I know that. I mean, he told them you were important to him. Renee nodded slowly. She looked at the children again.
The oldest was sitting quietly, staring at the floor. "Do they think I'm angry at them?" Marissa didn't answer immediately. "I think they're scared you are." Renee's face tightened. She looked down. "I'm angry at Williams. I know. They didn't do anything. No." Renee leaned back. For 12 years, Williams had made decisions for everyone. He decided when Renee would know. He decided when the children would meet her. He decided what Marissa could say. Now he was gone, and everyone else was left holding the consequences. Renee looked at the folder again. Did he leave anything specifically for them? Marissa nodded. He talked about it. Did he put it in writing? I don't know. Renee's first instinct was to say, "That's not my problem." And technically, it wasn't. These weren't her children. She hadn't created the secret. She hadn't promised them anything. She hadn't lied to them. But then the youngest child dropped the photograph. The frame hit the floor. He immediately bent down to pick it up. "Sorry," he whispered. Renee stood. "You don't have to apologize." The boy looked at her. His eyes were red. "I broke it. You didn't." She crouched and picked up the frame. The glass hadn't shattered. One corner had simply come loose. Renee handed it back. "There." He held it against his chest. "Thanks." Renee nodded. The boy walked back to Marissa. It was a tiny exchange, nothing dramatic, but Renee stood there for a moment after he left. She had spent days trying to understand what Williams had done to her. She had been so focused on the betrayal that she hadn't fully considered what his choices had done to the children. They had lost their father, and now they were standing in a room full of adults discussing what would happen to the life he had left behind. Renee sat back down. "Let's go through everything," she said. Marissa looked at her. "Everything? Yes. You don't have to do that. I know." Renee opened the folder. "I want to know what he promised them." Marissa watched her carefully. "You're sure?" Renee nodded. "I said I'd go through it." She began sorting the papers, not as their mother, not as Marissa's friend. Not because Williams deserved to have his secrets protected. She was doing it because the children shouldn't have to pay for a decision they never made. One of the papers showed a recurring payment for school expenses. Renee looked at it, then another, then another. She placed them into a separate stack. "What about this?" Marissa leaned forward. "That was for school. And this? Medical." Renee nodded. She kept sorting. The room grew quieter. After a while, Marissa said softly, "You don't have to take care of all this." Renee didn't look up. "I'm not." Marissa waited. Renee placed another document on the table. "I'm making sure what he was already doing doesn't disappear just because he did a terrible job telling the truth." Marissa looked at her. Renee finally met her eyes. "And I'm not going to pretend that makes me responsible for everything. I understand." Renee nodded. That boundary mattered. She wasn't replacing Williams. She wasn't repairing his relationship with Marissa. She wasn't suddenly becoming part of a family she had never been invited into. But she could refuse to let his mistake become the children's burden. As she gathered the papers into separate piles, Renee noticed something she hadn't expected. For the first time since the funeral, she wasn't thinking about what Williams had taken from her. She was thinking about what his children had already lost. And that changed what she was willing to do next. The house became quieter after everyone left. Renee didn't turn on the television. She didn't make dinner. She sat at the kitchen table with Williams's unfinished letter beside her and the photograph of the children facing down. She had read the letter 3 times. Each time the same sentence bothered her. You deserved the truth before you ever had to discover it. She wanted to believe that hearing those words would bring some relief. It didn't. Instead, they reminded her that Williams had known. He had understood. He had simply waited. Renee picked up the letter again. "Why didn't you trust me?" The words came out quietly. She looked at the empty chair across from her. Nothing. She almost laughed at herself. Williams wasn't going to answer. That was the part she kept forgetting. There would never be another conversation. No matter how many questions she came up with, there was no longer anyone sitting across from her who could answer them. She placed the letter down, then picked it up again. She remembered their first apartment, The terrible couch they had bought because it was cheap, the argument about whether they needed matching dishes, the way Williams used to leave the kitchen light on when he knew she would be coming home late. She remembered his hand on her back at family gatherings, the way he could make her laugh when she was determined to stay annoyed. Those memories were real, so was the secret. Renee rubbed her forehead. She had spent days trying to decide which version of Williams was the real one, the husband who loved her, or the man who lied to her for 12 years. But the more she thought about it, the less useful that question became. He had been both. That was what made it hurt. She stood and walked to the living room. On the bookshelf was a photograph from their anniversary. Williams had one arm around her. They were smiling. Renee picked it up. For a moment she considered putting it in a box. She couldn't. She placed it back. Then she looked at the photograph of the children. 3 faces, 3 lives, 3 people who had loved the same man she had loved. Renee sat down. She thought about the youngest boy holding the broken frame. "You don't have to apologize." The words came back to her. Neither did they. She picked up her phone and called Marissa. Marissa answered on the second ring. "Hello? It's me. I know." Renee almost smiled. "You sound tired." "I am." There was a pause. Renee looked at Williams's photograph. "Do the kids understand what happened?" "To their father? Yes. I don't think anybody understands." Renee nodded. That was probably true. Then she asked, "Did Williams ever tell them what he wanted for them?" Marissa hesitated. "He talked about their future." "That isn't what I asked." "I know." Renee waited. He wanted to make sure they were taken care of. Renee looked down. "Then we need to figure out what he actually left." Marissa was quiet. "Renee, you don't have to do this, I know." "Then why are you?" Renee didn't answer immediately, because the real answer was complicated. She wasn't doing it for Williams. She wasn't doing it because she suddenly felt like family. She was doing it because she had seen 3 children standing beside their father's casket, grieving while adults quietly discussed the mess he had left behind. "I don't want them paying for his decisions," she finally said. Marissa exhaled. "Okay." They ended the call a few minutes later. Renee remained on the couch. The house was silent. She looked toward Williams's chair. For years that chair had been ordinary. Now she couldn't look at it without thinking about all the things he had never said. She wanted to ask him one question more than any other. Not who were the children. She knew that now. Not did you love Marissa? She knew the answer to that too, in the limited way that mattered. She wanted to ask, why didn't you trust me? Why did he assume she would reject the children before she ever met them? Why did he decide a reaction for her? Why had he been more willing to let her live inside a lie than risk hearing an answer he might not like? Renee picked up the letter. She almost tore it. Her fingers tightened around the paper. For a second she imagined dropping it into the trash. It would be easier. She wouldn't have to keep rereading his words. She wouldn't have to wonder what he meant. She wouldn't have to carry his unfinished thoughts. She folded the letter once, then stopped. Renee looked at the handwriting. The final sentence ended halfway down the page. He hadn't finished. She slowly unfolded it. "No," she whispered. She put it back in the folder. Not because she forgave him. She wasn't ready for that. Maybe she never would be. But throwing away the letter wouldn't change what happened. It would only make it easier to avoid the truth. And Renee was tired of avoiding things other people had decided she couldn't handle. She stood and placed the folder in the desk drawer. Then she closed it. For the first time since Williams's death, she stopped asking herself whether he had been a good man or a bad one. That question was too simple for what she had learned. He had loved people. He had hurt people. He had shown up. He had lied. He had meant well sometimes. He had been afraid. None of those things canceled the others. Renee walked into the kitchen and turned off the light. The house went dark. She stood there for a moment before going upstairs. She still didn't know what she was going to do with the truth. But she knew one thing now. She didn't need to decide whether Williams deserved forgiveness before she could decide what the children deserved from her. And those were 2 very different decisions. The next morning, Renee spread everything across the dining table. Marissa's messages, the financial records, the photographs, Williams's unfinished letter. She didn't need more evidence. She needed to understand what all of it meant.
For years, Williams had told himself the secret was about protecting the people he loved. The evidence told a different story. He had protected the children from being abandoned. That part was real. When he learned that one of them wasn't biologically his, he stayed. He didn't use biology as an excuse to disappear. He kept showing up. That mattered. But it didn't excuse what he had done to Renee. Renee picked up one of Marissa's old messages. "You need to tell her." Years earlier. Then another. "The kids deserve to know why they're being hidden." Another. "You can't keep doing this." Renee placed the phone down. Marissa hadn't been helping Williams hide the truth. She had been pushing him toward it. Renee looked at the photographs. Williams at birthdays, Williams at school events, Williams beside the children, Williams smiling. He hadn't been pretending to love them, that was clear. Then she looked at the financial records, years of support, school expenses, medical bills, small payments made consistently. He had been taking responsibility for them. Again, that was real. Renee picked up the unfinished letter. His words were still difficult to read. "I don't want you to believe I kept them from you because you weren't enough." She closed her eyes. That was the part Williams had gotten wrong. Renee had never needed to be enough. She had needed to be trusted. He had made a decision for her before she ever had the chance to make one for herself. He had decided she would be hurt, decided she would be angry, decided she would misunderstand, and because he feared those possibilities, he gave her no opportunity to respond to the truth. Renee opened her eyes. For the first time, she could see the entire pattern. Williams had been trying to protect several things at once: the children, his marriage, his relationship with Marissa, his family, his image, and himself. Every time one of those things seemed threatened, he chose silence. But silence didn't remove the problem. It simply moved the problem forward, until the children were old enough to ask why they were hidden, until Marissa was exhausted from asking him to tell the truth, until Renee discovered everything beside his casket. Renee looked toward the empty chair. "You really thought you could keep everybody separate forever?" Her voice was quiet. She almost expected herself to cry. She didn't. Instead, she felt tired. A deep, ordinary tiredness. The kind that comes when you finally understand something you've been fighting against. Williams hadn't been living one lie. He had been living several truths that he refused to connect. He was Renee's husband. He was those children's father. He was Marissa's former fiancé. He was a man who loved people and still made selfish decisions. None of those things erased the others. She stopped. She picked up the photograph of the 3 children. The youngest was smiling in it. She turned it over. Williams had written a date on the back. Nothing else. Renee looked at the photograph for a long moment. Then she put it in the folder with the children's documents. She knew what she needed to do. Not everything, just the next thing. She called Marissa. "I've gone through the records." Marissa was quiet. "What did you find?" "Enough to know Williams was taking care of them." "He was." "I know." Renee paused. "I want to make sure that doesn't stop." Marissa didn't answer immediately. "You're sure?" "Yes. You don't have to." "I know." Renee looked at the folder. "But I'm not doing this because I'm forgiving him. I understand, and I'm not taking responsibility for everything he left behind." "I understand. I just don't want the children paying for his choices." Marissa's voice softened. "Thank you." Renee closed her eyes. "Don't thank me yet." Marissa gave a quiet laugh. It was the first time Renee had heard anything resembling humor from her. "I won't." They talked for another few minutes about the practical things that needed to be handled. Then Renee ended the call. She sat alone at the table. The house was still. She looked at Williams's unfinished letter one last time. For 12 years, he had wanted control over how the truth would be received. He never got it. Neither did Renee. Neither did Marissa. Neither did the children. But Renee could control what happened next. She could choose not to continue the secrecy. She could make sure the children knew they had never been the problem. She could acknowledge that Williams loved them without pretending he had treated everyone fairly. She could remember her marriage without rewriting it as either perfect or completely false. And she could grieve him without excusing him. Renee folded the letter carefully. Then she placed it back in the folder. She didn't tear it up. She didn't throw it away. She kept it, not as a symbol of forgiveness, as evidence of the truth. The truth was complicated. Williams's love had been real. His fear had been real. His dishonesty had been real too, and none of those things canceled the others. Renee stood and carried the folder back to his desk. She opened the drawer. Before closing it, she looked at the words written across the front, for Renee. Then she shut the drawer. For 12 years, Williams had kept two parts of his life separate. Now there was no separation left. The children knew who they were. Marissa no longer had to protect his secret. Renee finally knew the truth, and the one person who had spent all those years deciding when everyone else should know was gone. Renee walked away from the desk. This time she didn't look back. She couldn't change what Williams had done, but she could decide what his silence would mean from that point forward. The first time the children came back to Williams's house after the funeral, they stood at the front door without knocking. Renee saw them through the window. Marissa was behind them, one hand resting lightly on the youngest child's shoulder. Renee opened the door. "Come in." The oldest child looked at her. "Are you sure?" Renee nodded. "Yeah." They stepped inside. Nobody knew what to say. The house that had once belonged only to Renee and Williams suddenly held three people who had every right to remember Williams in a way Renee never had. The little girl looked toward the living room. Dad used to sit there. Renee followed her gaze. "He did. He watched football there." "I know." The girl looked at Renee. "You watched with him?" "Sometimes." That seemed to surprise her. "He said you didn't like football." The little girl smiled too. "Me neither." For the first time the room felt slightly less heavy. It lasted only a moment. Then the youngest child noticed a framed photograph on the shelf. It was Renee and Williams on their 10th anniversary. He walked toward it. "That's Dad." Renee nodded. "Yeah." The child looked at her. "He looks happy." Renee glanced at the photograph. He was. The answer came naturally. She didn't need to lie about that. Williams had been happy with her. He had also been happy with them. Those truths could exist together, even if she wished they hadn't needed to. The oldest child looked down. "Are you mad at us?" Renee turned toward him. "No." "Even though Dad didn't tell you?" Renee paused. "I'm mad at your dad." The boy nodded slowly. "Okay." Marissa watched Renee carefully. There was still distance between them. Renee didn't pretend otherwise. She wasn't interested in becoming Marissa's friend. She didn't want to hear stories about their old relationship. She didn't want to rebuild the past. But the children were different. They hadn't chosen any of it. Renee walked toward the desk. "I found some of your dad's things." The children looked up. "There are photographs," she said. "Some notes, a few things he kept." The little girl stepped closer. "Can we see?" "Sure." Renee opened a drawer. Inside was a small envelope with 3 names written across it. She handed it to Marissa. Marissa looked at the names and became quiet. "He made these?" "I think so." They opened the envelopes together. Inside each was something small, a photograph, a handwritten note, a memory Williams had apparently wanted each child to have. The youngest held his carefully. "He wrote this?" Renee nodded. "He did." The boy read it twice. Then he pressed the paper against his chest. Renee looked away. She didn't want the children watching her cry. Marissa quietly placed a hand on the boy's back. For a few minutes nobody spoke. Then the oldest said, "Dad told me we were going to meet you." Renee looked at him. "He did?" "Yeah." "When?" "Before he died." Renee swallowed. "He should have told me sooner." The boy nodded. "I know." That answer surprised her. "How?" He shrugged. "He always said he was going to." Renee looked at Marissa. Marissa didn't say anything. There was no need. Renee understood. The children had been waiting too. They had been carrying their own version of the same disappointment. Williams had kept telling everyone there would be a better time. There never was. Over the following weeks, the practical matters began settling. The children were openly acknowledged as Williams's family. There was no longer any reason to whisper about them. Renee helped make sure the things Williams had intended for them reached them. School records were handled. Personal belongings were sorted. Photographs were divided. Important papers were copied. Renee kept only what belonged to her. She was careful about that.
One afternoon, Marissa thanked her. "You've done more than you had to." Renee shook her head. "I know." Marissa waited. Renee looked toward the children, who were sitting in the living room looking through old photographs. "This doesn't mean everything is okay. I know. It isn't. I know." Renee looked at her. "I don't blame them." Marissa nodded. "I know." Renee took a breath. "I don't want them thinking they were the reason he lied." Marissa's eyes filled. "They never were. I know that." Renee looked down. "I just want them to know it too." Marissa nodded. For a moment the two women stood quietly. They were not friends. They were not family in the way either of them would have chosen. But they were connected by a man who had loved both parts of his life and had failed to bring them together honestly. Inside the living room, the youngest child laughed. Renee turned toward the sound. The boy was holding an old photograph of Williams, making a ridiculous face at the camera. "Dad looked stupid," he said. Renee laughed before she could stop herself. "He did that on purpose." The boy grinned. "He did it all the time." Renee looked at the photograph. She remembered. Williams had done that exact face whenever she tried to take a serious picture. For a second she felt the familiar ache, but it wasn't the same ache anymore. She was no longer trying to decide whether she had loved a stranger. She hadn't. She had loved Williams. And Williams had loved people in ways that were sometimes generous and sometimes deeply selfish. Both were true. Renee looked at the children. She couldn't give them their father back. She couldn't repair what Williams had broken. But she could make sure they never again had to wonder whether they were allowed to call him Dad. That part, at least, no longer had to be a secret. A few weeks later, Renee came home to a house that still felt too quiet. She set her keys on the counter and stood there for a moment. Williams's shoes were still by the door. His jacket was still hanging where he had left it. The coffee mug he always used was in the cabinet. None of those things had changed. What had changed was what Renee knew about them. She no longer looked at his belongings as simple pieces of their marriage. Everything seemed to carry another story. She walked into the bedroom and opened the small drawer beside her nightstand. Inside was the anniversary box Williams had given her on their 10th anniversary. Renee hadn't touched it since the funeral. She took it out and sat on the edge of the bed. The box was still wrapped in the same paper. She opened it. Inside was the watch Williams had given her and the small photograph they'd taken that night. Renee smiled faintly at the picture. They had been laughing because Williams had complained that the photographer kept telling him where to stand. "You're not supposed to argue with the photographer," Renee had told him. "I wasn't arguing. You were. I was negotiating." She had laughed so hard she'd almost ruined the picture. Renee ran her thumb along the photograph. Then she noticed something underneath it. A folded sheet of paper. Her name was written across the front. She recognized the handwriting immediately. Her fingers became still. She unfolded it. The first lines were familiar. She had already read part of the letter, but there were several additional pages she hadn't seen before. Renee began reading. Williams wrote that he understood why she might never forgive him. He didn't ask her to. He wrote that he had spent years waiting for the right moment to tell her about the children, and eventually he understood that there was no perfect moment because the truth itself was going to hurt. He admitted that he had been afraid she would think his relationship with the children meant he had never truly left his past. Then came the sentence that made Renee stop. "I was afraid you would make me choose." She lowered the paper. For a while she stared at the floor. That was the fear he had never admitted aloud. He had imagined that if Renee knew, she might ask him to choose between his marriage and the children. And instead of trusting her with the truth, he had made the choice for her. Renee continued reading. Williams explained that the paternity discovery had changed something inside him. He had realized that one of the children didn't share his blood, but the child still called him Dad. He had thought about stepping away. He couldn't. The child needed him. More importantly, Williams needed to remain. He wrote that fatherhood had stopped being about biology a long time ago. Then he admitted something else. The children had begun noticing the secrecy. They knew about Renee. They knew she was important to their father, and they had started asking why they weren't allowed to meet her. Williams wrote that their questions frightened him because he finally understood what his secrecy was teaching them. He was teaching them that love sometimes had to be hidden. Renee pressed the letter against her lap. She looked toward the bedroom doorway. "That's what you were afraid of?" Her voice was barely audible. She looked back at the page. Williams had written that he intended to introduce the children to Renee. He intended to stop living two separate lives. He intended to explain everything. He had even started planning how he would do it. Then the writing changed. The final paragraphs became shorter, less polished, more personal. "I kept thinking I needed more time." Renee read the sentence again. "I thought if I waited until I could explain everything perfectly, you would understand why I waited. But waiting became the thing I was most ashamed of." Her eyes filled. Williams had finally understood. Just too late. The last sentence was the one that stayed with her. "I should have trusted the woman I married enough to let her decide what the truth meant to her." Renee stopped reading. She folded the pages carefully. The letter didn't make her forgive him. It didn't make the betrayal smaller. If anything, it confirmed how much time he had been given to make a different choice. But it gave her something she had needed since the funeral. The truth. Not the polished version. Not Marissa's explanation. Not something pieced together from bank statements and photographs. His own words. Renee cried then. Quietly. She cried for the husband she had lost. For the marriage she had thought she understood. For the children who had spent years waiting. For the woman who had repeatedly asked Williams to do what he should have done himself. And for Williams, because he had loved people sincerely and still managed to hurt them through fear. When she finished, Renee placed the letter back inside the box. She picked up the photograph of the 3 children. She had found it among Williams's things a few days earlier. The 3 of them were standing close together. Williams was behind them, smiling. Renee studied his face. He looked happy. She no longer needed to question whether that happiness had been real. It had been. She put the photograph beside the letter. Then she closed the box. Renee sat there for a long time. She knew what she could forgive. She knew what she couldn't. But one thing was finally clear. She didn't have to choose between remembering Williams with love and acknowledging that he had betrayed her. She could do both. She could miss him and still be angry. She could appreciate the man he had been to her and still refuse to excuse the man he had chosen to become when he was afraid. She could remember the marriage without pretending the secret hadn't changed it. Renee placed the box back in the drawer. This time, she didn't close the drawer immediately. She looked at the letter one last time. Williams had spent 12 years trying to decide when she should know the truth. Now that she finally knew, the decision belonged entirely to her. She closed the drawer. And for the first time, that felt less like an ending than a choice. Renee didn't call Marissa the next morning. She didn't call Williams's sister either. She made coffee, opened the curtains, and sat at the kitchen table with the anniversary box beside her. For the first time since the funeral, she wasn't trying to decide what Williams had been. She was deciding what she wanted to do next. There was a difference. The children were not hers. She wasn't going to pretend they were. Marissa wasn't suddenly her friend. She wasn't interested in rebuilding a relationship that had never existed. And Williams's letter wasn't going to erase 12 years of dishonesty. Those things were clear. But another thing was clear too. The children had done nothing wrong. Renee picked up her phone and called Marissa. Hi, I've been thinking. Marissa waited. I want the kids to have the things Williams meant for them to have. I'll make sure they do. I know. Renee paused. But I want you to understand something. Okay. This doesn't mean I'm taking over. I know. And it doesn't mean we're going to pretend we're family. Marissa was quiet for a moment. I wouldn't expect that. Good. Renee looked at the box on the table. I just don't want them growing up thinking their father's secret was their fault. Marissa's voice softened. It wasn't. I know. Renee swallowed. But they may not always know that. Marissa didn't argue. Then we'll make sure they do. Renee nodded, even though Marissa couldn't see her. That was enough. Over the next few weeks, the children came by occasionally. Not every day, not even every week. Renee didn't force it. Sometimes they came to collect something Williams had left for them. Sometimes they wanted to look through photographs. Once, the oldest asked if he could see the chair where Williams used to sit. Renee showed him. He sat down. For a moment, he looked strangely comfortable there.
Dad used to fall asleep here. He did. Sometimes he'd say he wasn't sleeping. Renee smiled. He said that to me too. The boy laughed. That small laugh caught Renee off guard. She realized that memories didn't have to belong to only one person. Williams had left pieces of himself in all of them. She could allow that without giving up her own memories. One afternoon, the youngest child stood at the door before leaving. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure. Are you still mad at Dad?" Renee looked at him. It was an honest question. She could have given him the easy answer. Instead, she said, "Sometimes." The boy looked down. "Are you mad at us?" "No." He nodded. "Okay." He started walking away. Then Renee called him back. "Hey." He turned. "Your dad loved you." The boy's eyes filled. "I know." Renee smiled gently. "Good." He left with Marissa. Renee closed the door. She stood there for a moment. Then she looked toward Williams's photograph. She didn't feel the need to apologize to him for what she had said. It was true. He had loved the children, and he had hurt her. Both things could remain true. That was the part she had struggled with most. For a while, Renee thought healing meant deciding which version of Williams she should remember. Now she understood that she didn't have to choose. She could remember the man who made her laugh in the kitchen, the man who knew how she took her coffee, the man who showed up for the children, and the man who lied when telling the truth would have required courage. None of those memories canceled the others. One evening, Renee opened the anniversary box again. She took out the photograph, then the letter. She read the final page one more time. Williams had written that he hoped someday she would understand that the children had never been a threat to their marriage. Renee folded the letter. "I understand," she whispered. Then she added, "But you still should have told me." The room remained quiet. Renee smiled sadly. She didn't need an answer anymore. She finally understood that forgiveness wasn't something she owed Williams because he had died, and it wasn't something she had to refuse because he had hurt her. It was something she would decide in her own time. Maybe someday she would forgive him completely. Maybe she wouldn't. Either way, she could move forward. Renee put the letter back in the box and placed the photograph beside it. Then she closed the lid. She didn't throw anything away. She didn't cling to it either. She simply put the box in the drawer and closed it. The children would grow up knowing who their father was. They would. Never again have to wonder whether they were supposed to hide their love for him. Marissa would no longer have to protect a secret that wasn't hers to carry. And Renee would continue living with the truth, not as a wound she had to revisit every morning, but as something that had changed her understanding of the man she married. Williams had believed secrecy would protect the people he loved. In the end, it hurt all of them. Renee couldn't change that, but she could make sure the children didn't inherit his silence. She turned off the kitchen light. Then she stood in the darkness for a moment before heading upstairs. The marriage she remembered had been real. The betrayal had been real too. And perhaps growing older meant learning that life could hold two truths without forcing one to erase the other. Renee had lost her husband. She had lost the version of her marriage she thought she knew. But she had not lost herself. And that, finally, was what she chose to keep. If this story touched you, take a moment before you leave and think about Renee's situation. Do you believe Williams's love for Renee and his love for those children can both be real, even though he kept such an important part of his life hidden from her? And if you were Renee, would you forgive Williams after discovering the truth at his funeral? Or would the 12 years of secrecy be something you could never move past? Tell me your honest answer in the comments. I'd really like to hear how you see it. If this story reminded you that love without honesty can still cause deep pain, please like this video and share it with someone who might need that message today. And if you're new to Mr. Graham's stories, subscribe and become part of our growing family. We'll keep bringing you emotional stories about love, family, choices, consequences, forgiveness, and the lessons hidden inside ordinary lives. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. Until the next story, take care of yourself and remember, sometimes the truth hurts, but living honestly gives people the chance to decide what they can forgive.
Thank you for watching Mr. Graham's stories, my beautiful, amazing family.